Okay, hello everybody. I want to talk about sovereign wealth funds. Now, this is a new topic for the exam this year. So what I would like you to do is there's a lot of definitions here. And there's a lot of things maybe that are new to you or maybe you're not experienced. Sovereign wealth funds are becoming a big part of the investment community. And I'm actually really glad that the CFA Institute has brought this into the exam because you need to have all the skills and knowledge of what's going on in the industry. So I'm going to cover a lot of definitions and terms. Quite honestly, you can read slides as well as I do. So there's a lot of things here. Quite honestly, you're just going to have to memorize. Now, we talked about the importance of institutions. I still say endowments and foundations, basically, and defined benefit plans are going to be the most heavily tested. Sovereign wealth funds are be sort of a wild card. So what I would like you to do is I want you to think about towards the end of our slide deck. We have investment objectives and we have asset allocation. We put together some really nice tables that are going to help you with this material. This is where I would like you to focus on. And if it were me, I'd be thinking about putting together some note cards to really emphasize these objectives and the asset allocation. You know, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that you can't memorize. You can't know everything. So I think if you understand what's the point of these funds and how do they have to invest because of their liquidity needs, I think you'll be on the right track. So again, we'll go through the beginning slides and help you with some of the definitions. And it's really going to be just some memorization here. There's not a lot of unique things going on here. Yes, there are differences in the funds and the different types, but really understand the objectives and how to build the portfolio, because ultimately you're going to build portfolios. That's what we do, so we have to understand these things. And again, we're still using the same institutional process that we started a few sections ago. You're still looking at objectives and constraints. We're maximizing those. So let's go ahead and get going. So sovereign wealth funds, what are they? Well, guess what? They're funds that are owned by a government and they're designed to do certain things. Now, the International Monetary Fund is going to define 5 broad categories of sovereign wealth funds. I think this is really important to know. And in my note cards that I would put together, I would make sure I would write out the 5 broad categories. I'd understand them, just basics, what their goals, what are they intended to do. And then I would focus more on the investment objectives, as I'm talking about, and then ultimately the asset allocation. How do you build that portfolio? Okay, so the first one that we have, according to the IMF category, is the Budget Stabilization Fund. So maybe a nation's revenues are highly linked, maybe to oil or some cyclical industry. So basically what the government's going to do is they're going to use these funds to basically insulate themselves from volatility. Just like investors, we don't like a lot of volatility. Corporations don't like a lot of volatility in their operating profits and their revenues. And governments don't like a lot of volatility either. Okay, so the next category are development funds. So what is a development fund? Well, they're basically trying to achieve some social economic project, some social economic goal. So what are the things that are brought up in the material? So they talk about infrastructure. Okay, so that's a good way to think about it. Development funds, infrastructure is a good idea, and supporting key industries, maybe healthcare, okay, or medical services. We'll dive into that. Okay, a third category is going to be savings funds. So they're going to basically invest revenues from any non-renewable assets. Hey, they're selling this oil or whatever that product is, or that resource, and they're putting this money away for the benefit of future generations. So as we're kind of going through these and you're thinking about asset allocation, I want you to again focus on time horizon. mean, think about budget stabilization funds. If you've got to have money at any given time when a resource spikes or decreases, this time horizon is going to be fairly low. A development fund, if we're looking at supporting key industries or infrastructure, this time horizon is going to be pretty long. And if we're thinking about benefits of future generations, you can bet this time horizon is going to be long. So again, that time horizon is going to impact the actual asset allocation, and that's where we're going with this information. So again, I'm not telling you to be an expert on every one of these categories defined by the IMF, but you have to at least understand the basics to give yourself a fighting chance if this question happens to show up on the exam. Okay, we also have reserve funds. What's a reserve fund? Well, they're designed to earn a little bit of extra return on excess foreign curves that are held by central banks. Okay, so basically these foreign exchange reserves, they're low yielding assets. They're not exciting, they're not sexy, they're not glamorous. They're low yielding assets compared to bonds issued by the central banks that are going to make up these liabilities. So what are these reserve funds' goal? What's their investment objective? We want to reduce this negative cost of carry. So we issued these bonds to cover a certain interest rate. Well, we're going to have to pay that rate. And these foreign reserves that we're holding, they're very low yielding. How can we use some of those funds, invest them to offset some of this negative cost of carry? And then the last category are these pension reserve funds. So they're used to save and invest to meet future pension liabilities of government. So ultimately, reach socioeconomic goals and implement social justice that country's trying to do. So again, you think about long term, well, you've got a long-term focus, or at least time horizon, and the pension reserve funds, you've got a long-term focus. So again, we're just giving you some generalities to help you. I think these slides are fantastic. This is about as deep as I would dive into sovereign wealth funds, and I'd read the Kaplan, the Schwesser notes as well. But digging in and spending weeks and weeks to understand this, I just don't think it's worth the effort. Again, I'd much rather you put your time in defined benefit plans and endowments and foundations. And we talked about banks and insurance that we're going to cover later. They're just not heavily tested. Okay, so let's talk about stakeholders. It's an interesting view to think about sovereign wealth funds as stakeholders. So I think the biggest stakeholder that should jump out at you, the citizens. So they're going to benefit from these funds by receiving payments, or maybe lower taxes, or maybe both. And again, these are sophisticated investment firms and companies that are managing these, and governments that are hiring people to manage these. So these sovereign wealth funds, they could be managed directly in-house, or they're likely to appoint external managers also. There's a governance structure. We have a board. They have fiduciary duty. Where is it? It's to the beneficiaries. So always remember, where is that duty held? Well, in sovereign wealth funds, it's to the beneficiaries. And who's another stakeholder? Well, government jumps out because basically they're the ones that need this to balance budget deficits. Okay, so let's look at liabilities and investment horizon. So what I want you to make this association right here, liabilities of sovereign wealth fund, they're going to be linked to their overall mission, and this is the problem. They're generally less well-defined than other types of institutions. Remember when we reviewed private wealth portfolio management, there was a lot of complexity because people have a lot of unique goals. Then we went to the institutional space. Everything was more laid out. It was more straightforward. Well, unfortunately, the sovereign wealth funds, it's a little more complicated, and they're not as generally, this overall mission and goals, they're not as well defined as other types of institutions. So just know that. And we've got these budget stabilization liability that we're talking about. So we've got some uncertain liability that's linked to some uncertainty, commodity price or cyclical industry. And ultimately what we're doing is we're going to have to support this budget on a short-term basis. Okay, So that's really that liability that that budget stabilization fund is working on. When you look at a development fund, we talked about support social economic investments. These are long-term infrastructure and maybe even medium-term when it comes to medical resources. So understanding the liabilities of these 5 International Monetary Fund classifications, I think can give you good insight of really what their objectives are going to be. Okay, so moving on. If we have a savings, well, the liabilities are linked to future generations. So again, we have long-term reserve funds. So we talked about the liabilities are technically the yield promised on the bonds issued by the central banks or that government. Well, that's not really where they're targeting. They want to get a little bit higher return than that. So we pretty much have no near-term liabilities. So this time horizon is extremely long. Okay, pension reserves. So these liabilities are linked to future pension payments, therefore, again, long-term. So understanding where the liabilities are, I believe will help you deal with your investment objectives and the asset allocation, which ultimately you build portfolios. That's your job. Your job is not to give advice on countries how to set up their governance structures or how to support what they want to. They'll make those decisions and their citizens will make those decisions. Your job is to build the portfolio to help them with that. So we talk about these pension funds. The literature talks about there's an accumulation stage and a decumulation phase. So we've got contributions are going in the accumulation stage, then they're coming out in the decumulation phase. So basically, what is the time horizon here? Well, it's going to depend on when these stages occur. Okay, so nothing too crazy about that idea. Let's look at liquidity needs. This, to me, is important. And again, as I'm putting down note cards, I would make sure, and I'll show you towards the end, we have some great slides. I'd make sure that you have these ideas cemented. And again, I don't want you to dive too much into this, but understanding the liquidity needs, understanding what they have to do will help you with the investment objective. We'll ultimately figure out what assets can we put in here. So budget stabilization fund, they have to maintain the highest level basically of liquidity. So right off the bat, you know they're not going into liquid investments like alternative investments. So we're dealing with short-term time period here. So those are our liquidity needs. So we're going to have to assets that have to be fairly liquid. We look at a development fund. So these are long-term. The funds are needed to develop these products or projects in the future. So what do we have? We have low liquidity needs. Whereas in the budget stability fund, we have high, in fact, the highest liquidity level needs out of our 5 categories. Now, savings funds. Hey, we need to accumulate wealth for future generations. Okay, sounds like there's not many liquidity needs right now, so they're very low. Reserve funds. Now, reserve funds, the liquidity needs, they're lower compared to stabilization funds, but they're higher liquidity compared to savings funds. So what do we have here? Normally, liquid fixed income securities are overconcentrated in this portfolio. Okay, pension reserve funds. Liquidity needs are going to vary, but I want you to think about it's really zeroing in on this time period of how long do you have to accumulate money, and then when are you going to start taking money out? That's going to determine the liquidity needs here. Okay, how about external constraints? It's always good to understand who's putting pressure on this fund, who's likely to fail or be hurt if these things don't work. So these sovereign wealth funds, they're established by laws that give the sovereign wealth fund its mission and structure. Now, one of the issues that the Institute talks about, which I think is important, they want these sovereign wealth funds to avoid political influence. So what we find is sovereign wealth funds, they're going to demonstrate some things to avoid this political influence. So we've got high quality governance, we've got independence, and we've got transparency. Okay, and then the last one, accountability. So we want these sovereign wealth funds, again, to avoid this appearance of political influence. And we're going to do that by building a high quality governance structure, showing independence, showing exactly what you're doing, being transparent, and being accountable. Okay, so we need a best practice framework. So the Institute talks about the Santiago Principles. Now, these were established by the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds. And what are some things that it addresses? Ethics, risk management, and regular monitoring with principles. You notice this is very similar to what you've been taught in the Code and Standards. So we need a best practice framework for sovereign wealth funds. Just know the Santiago Principle is that best practices, and I would understand some of the key elements. Hey, it has an high quality ethics system. It has a high quality risk management system, and it implies compliance and regular monitoring. So again, if the Santiago Principles just happen to be brought up on the exam, it's not going to throw you a curveball. You understand what it is, it's the best practice framework, and you understand the key elements. That's as deep as I want you to go, and then move on. Okay, this is what I was talking about in the tables. This is where I really would be focusing, and this is where I want you to focus. So we look at the type. Remember, there are 5 from the International Monetary Fund classifications. So we've got Budget Stabilization Fund. What is its investment objective? Well, you got to basically preserve the capital, and I want you to earn returns above inflation with a low probability of loss. The other thing that's also important, we want to avoid assets correlated with the source of government revenue. So if you're getting a lot of your revenue from the government from oil, you shouldn't have a portfolio that's heavily concentrated in oil. In a development type sovereign wealth fund, we want you to support that nation's economic development goals, whatever they are, they're long run. So we want to earn a real, and this is the key, a real rate of return greater than the real domestic GDP or whatever productivity growth that they're looking at. Okay, moving on to the third category, savings. We want you to maintain purchasing power over time while making ongoing spending to government budgetary needs as needed. Reserve funds. You're going to earn a rate of return greater than that yield that the central bank promised on issuing its debt. That's the whole point of reserve yield. You want to juice the return just a little bit, but don't go crazy. You're not putting in alternative investments, overweighting. You're going to have a holding on alternative investments, but at the end of the day, we want a return greater than the yield. Okay, and then we've got these pension reserves, where basically any unfunded pension or social care payments promised by the government, we want to use this to supplement it. So I think it's very important to understand the 5 types and understand the investment objectives of each type, because ultimately they're just going to help you get to the next part, which is asset allocation and getting closer to building those portfolios. So let's jump into asset allocation. That budget stabilization fund, guess what? Because it has to be liquid, the majority is fixed income and cash. This is defensive. So you can already tell there's not a high weighting to alternative investments here. Now, development funds. So these are going to be driven by the social economic mission of the fund. That's, depending on what they're trying to do, is going to impact the asset allocation. A savings fund, what do we have here? They typically follow the endowment model. So they have a high allocation to equities and alternative investments, with likely holdings in private equity and substantial holdings in real assets also. Okay, and then reserve funds. So we talked about that. So the allocation is similar to savings funds, but they have a lower allocation to alternative investments just because they may have higher liquidity needs in the future. So again, that's what I'm talking about. If you understand the classifications, understand their investment objectives, It will help you when you're building these asset allocations. And then finally, these pension reserve funds. So what do we find here? They also follow the endowment model. If you forget what that means, what means you're going to have a high allocation to equities and a high allocation to alternative investments. Why? Because there's very low liquidity needs and a very long time horizon. So again, to summarize, sovereign wealth funds, they're a new topic. I would feel more comfortable if you focused on the last few slides, focus on investment objectives, focus on asset allocation, and focus on just having a general understanding. And I also want you to remind yourself of the Santiago principle and having a model that you can use for best practices. So again, don't spend an inordinate amount of time. I truly think the Kaplan notes are fantastic and our slides are sovereign wealth funds. I would much rather you spend your time in defined benefit plans, endowments, and foundations. You need to be comfortable with this material. There's not a lot here. You understand the 5 funds, understand their investment objectives, and understand the allocation.